Okay, are there questions? Okay, so let me begin. Okay. So recall that we have been studying scalar perturbation. Okay. And there is one main remaining task. In scalar perturbation. Okay. And that is to find the precise relation between delta t over t and Ri. Because we have been saying that we can express all scalar fluctuation in terms of the two-point function of the Ri's, which you know how to calculate during inflation. Okay. But you want to find a precise relation between these two. Okay. In other words, okay, we want to calculate the function f kt that relates to Ri. Okay. So this will involve some complicated analysis, and it will probably take 2 lectures. And because of this, we are going to postpone this to next week. So today what I'm planning to do, okay, so don't think that we have left the subject of scalar perturbation, because this is an important point we have to discuss, but you will see that there are many effects. Okay, one of them, of course, is the redshift that I have alluded to, okay, but there are various other effects. But today what we plan to do is how to detect tensor perturbation. Okay. And here I'm going to only give the results. Okay. And you can look at the details, okay, in this Dorelson's book on modern cosmology. Okay. And in principle, this could be a project topic, right? If you have not already decided on this, okay, this could certainly be a project topic on detecting tensor perturbation. Okay. So this will not take very long. It will be a short lecture, and then I thought what I'll do is to spend some time discussing possible project topics, okay, because that's what you have to do next. Okay. But I'll just give some qualitative discussion of how the tensor perturbation is detected. Okay. So the main tool here is the polarization of CMB. So far, we have not talked about polarization. We have been saying we look at the temperature. Okay. But of course, if you have a thermal equilibrium, then both polarizations occur with equal frequency. Okay, so that means that the radiation is unpolarized. Okay. But we will see that the CMB can be polarized, and that observation will play a crucial role in trying to detect tensor perturbation. Okay. So first, let's discuss how is CMB polarized. Okay, because to begin with, you don't expect in a thermal ensemble to have any polarization. So for this, let's consider the last scattering. So what happens during last scattering is that there is an E minus, okay, which is you can think of this as a non-relativistic, a heavy E minus. Then a photon comes in with some momentum q and gets deflected. Okay, let's call this q prime, and it gets deflected with some momentum q. And because this is the last scattering, okay, by definition, that's what is going to reach us. Okay, so this is us. And what one can show is that the cross section for this process is proportional to epsilon dot epsilon prime mod square, where this epsilon and epsilon prime are just the polarizations of the incoming and outgoing photons. So if the photons come from a fixed direction for incoming gamma coming from fixed direction, a specific direction, will give polarized outgoing gamma. And this is even if the incoming gamma is not polarized. And that's because this cross section depends on epsilon. And we'll now see an extreme example of this. Okay, how this actually happens. Okay, but this is a general statement that for a fixed incoming direction, the outgoing photon, okay, comes out polarized. Okay, even if the incoming photon is not polarized, that means that there is equal probability that it's polarized in this direction or in the transverse direction. Okay. So let's illustrate this by considering this extreme case. Where the incoming photon comes in a direction that is transverse to the direction of the outgoing photon. Okay, so the same picture, okay, but now drawn in a slightly different fashion. So imagine that you have a photon coming in like this, q prime. So let's say this is along the x-axis, and the outgoing photon, okay, comes out like this. This is us, and let's say this is the z-axis. Then the incoming photon polarization epsilon prime. Of course, epsilon prime has to be orthogonal to the momentum. Okay. So here, because the original momentum is along the x direction, epsilon prime can have y or z component. Okay. So I'll write this as 0 epsilon prime y, epsilon prime z. Similarly, epsilon, the outgoing photon polarization, it has to be perpendicular to the z direction. So it's epsilon x, epsilon y, epsilon z. So epsilon dot epsilon prime, you can see from here, is epsilon y, epsilon y prime.
It is 0. The epsilon z is not there.
Sorry, epsilon z is 0. Thank you. So this means that the outgoing photon has no, okay, maybe say no polarized outgoing photons with epsilon x polarization. So no outgoing photon with epsilon x polarization. Right? Because if epsilon x is non-zero and epsilon y is zero, then this is zero. That means the cross section for producing such photons vanish. Okay, so even though, so this is true even if the incoming photon is not polarized. Okay, so that means even if the incoming photon has equal probability of y and z polarization, the outgoing photon always has y polarization. Is this point clear?
So, but kinematically, there are many, like, outgoing photon direction can be anything.
Yes. So we are looking at a given direction. I think what you mean to say is that the incoming photon direction can be many things. Because if we are here, right, and we are looking in a given direction in the sky, then the outgoing photon direction, there is no choice, right?
Yeah, okay. In
Or
that
it can
sense,
go in many directions, but those are not going to reach us.
yeah. So in our direction, a particular polarization is coming for a particular, like, propagation direction of an incoming photon.
Exactly. Okay, so that's the statement. Now, it's an easy exercise to show that if the incoming radiation is unpolarized and isotropic, then the outgoing photon is not polarized. For example, in the previous case, suppose the incoming photon was coming along the y direction instead of the x direction. In which case, the outgoing photon will carry only x polarization and no y polarization. So the effects will just cancel out. Okay, so if the incoming photon doesn't carry is unpolarized, that means it's equally probable to get have polarization in the other direction. Okay. And if it's isotropic, that means it's equally probable for it to come from all directions. Okay. Then the outgoing photon is not depolarized. Okay, and that, I mean, at least it follows the standard intuition, because rotational unsymmetry will tell us that you cannot have a preferred direction, okay, if everything is isotropic. Okay, the only preferred direction is that the polarization has to be transverse to this, of course, okay, but otherwise there should be no preferred direction. However, due to fluctuations, the incoming photon may have small anisotropy. And this is what causes polarization in CMB. So this is polarization in the CMB coming from a particular direction. And later on, of course, we have to look at the 2-point correlation function of these polarizations. Okay, and I'll define appropriate quantity that will be analyzed. That eventually can be used to test tensor modes. Now, it turns out that in general, both scalar and tensor modes can cause this anisotropy. So what we are going to describe, okay, without proof, we will describe without proof a way to isolate tensor mode effects. Okay, and as I said, you can look up Dodelson's book, okay, where you can find more details of this. So to do this, we'll define what is called the intensity tensor. Which, as its name suggests, it's a tensor. Okay? The rank we'll see soon. Okay? So this is up to some constant. Okay, it's EIEG. And here, this averaging is the average over radiation coming from a given direction. Okay, not angular average. So this is very specifically not angular average, which will be done later. So you are not talking about the 2-point correlation function of fluctuations. Okay, we are just defining fluctuations themselves. Okay, so in other words, and EI is the basically electric field component. Okay, so this is the electric field component, which also is the same as the polarization. Okay. But the point is that the weight factor that we associate with this is the energy of the photon, right? Because this should be proportional to the energy of the photon. So more energetic photons are given given more weight, less energetic photons are given less weight. That's all. Because in general, there will be distribution of the radiation, right? Different frequencies will have different numbers, okay? And this is basically the total average over the radiation coming from a given direction. So this clearly carries information about the polarization. Now, EI, of course, should be transverse to the direction of the photon, right? So EI or E is perpendicular to the direction of travel. Okay, so once we fix a given direction in the sky, then the E can only be a linear combination of the two vectors that are orthogonal to that direction. So to describe this, okay, we can introduce for every direction, for every direction, introduce a pair of basis vectors let me write it as orthonormal basis vectors. E1, so E hat 1 and E hat 2. So that this E I can express in as linear combinations of E hat 1 and E hat 2. Okay. And this makes Ij is a 2 by 2 matrix. Okay, so instead of having a 3 by 3 matrix, which is really redundant information because when you're looking in a given direction, E can only be orthogonal to this. So it's described by 2 by 2 matrix. But of course, as you change the basis vector, if you rotate the basis, this matrix will change, right? It will change by conjugation, and we'll soon discuss how this matrix changes as you rotate the basis vectors. Okay, and the final result will be independent of that choice of basis vectors, right? But at the intermediate stage, we have to introduce the basis vectors and then define this 2 by 2 matrix I.
So just to clarify, this averages over the frequencies of the radiation?
Yes, frequencies of the radiation. Anything that is coming from a given direction, right? So suppose you have a given temperature, right? Then you expect a Planck distribution.
Yeah.
Right? So, and you average overall frequencies of the radiation. Okay, you wait for certain time, say, right? And do the type so that you collect enough radiation from a given direction. And then you average over all the frequencies. But our frequency will be given larger weight because the energies are larger, right?
Yeah.
That's all. Yeah. So otherwise, it's the average over the frequencies. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll now define various quantities. So we define Q, which is 1/4 of I11 minus I22. Okay, you may recognize some of these from the physics of gravitational waves. U is half I12 and T is 1/4 I11 plus I2. Okay. Now it's an easy exercise to check that under a change of basis states, under a rotation of the basis vectors, of the form, say E hat 1, E hat 2, okay, you rotate to cos alpha sin alpha minus sin alpha cosine alpha times E hat 1, E hat 2. Okay. So this rotation, what it is going to do, the way it's going to act on the matrix I is by conjugation, right? Because I has these two index, I and J. So it will act by multiplication by this from the left and the multiplication by transpose of this from the right. Okay, the transpose is the same as inverse in this case because this is just a rotation matrix. So using this, one can easily check that T is invariant. Right? Because T is just a trace of I. And Q and U transforms. Okay, and in particular, Q plus IU transforms as e to the power minus plus 2I alpha times Q plus minus I. Okay, so this is the decomposition. Okay, and you can perhaps recognize the similarity between this and what we did for the gravitational waves. And the similarity is simply because of the fact that in both cases, we are talking about the symmetric rank 2 tensor. So far you have been looking at one direction. So now we consider radiation from different directions. So this means that yes.
Hello? The trace part is affected by the scalar, and the two other parts are affected by tensor modes, is it?
No, we'll see that out of this Q and U, in fact, one combination is affected by both tensor and scalar, and the other one is affected only by the tensor.
Okay.
So T is clearly affected only by the scalar mode because T is a scalar. Okay, but here it's not that the scalar doesn't affect this at all.
Sir, in the LHS also it's Q plus minus IU equal this.
Sorry, yeah, thank you. Q plus minus I, yes. Okay, so this question we are going to address in a few minutes. Okay, I'll not prove anything, as I said. Okay, but I'll state the results. Okay, but you can look up in this Dodelson book. I think you can find a very detailed discussion of this. Okay, so once you consider radiation from different directions, then you have to think of T as a function of theta and phi, and similarly Q as a function of theta and phi, and U as a function of theta and phi. And then we would expand in the basis of YLM. Okay, that's what we have been doing. So, for example, T theta phi can be expanded as YLM theta phi times TLM. Now, for Q and U, we use a slightly different basis, and the reason is because you can see that Q and U actually depend on the choice of basis, right? Because even in a given direction, as you rotate the basis, Q and U can change. So what we do is that we expand Q and U in what is called tensor spherical harmonics, and in this particular case, it goes as follows. So Q plus minus IU as expanded as sum over LM. The basis that we choose is what is called Y plus minus 2 LM theta phi. I'll define what this is. And then the coefficients TLM I'm calling A plus minus 2 LM. Okay, so theta phi dependence here, these are the coefficients of expansion. So these are the analogs of the TLMs. So these are defined as follows. So Y plus minus 2 LM theta phi. So you can define such spherical harmonics for also higher rank tensors. But these are defined as this epsilon plus minus I, epsilon plus minus J. Okay, this is one way to construct this. So these are the circular polarization bases. Okay, so these are like epsilon hat 1 plus minus I epsilon hat 2. And the idea is that you have chosen this in such a way that these also rotate as you rotate the basis, and they cancel. So the fact that the Q plus minus IU rotates as you rotate the basis is the same rotation that affects YLM theta phi, okay, the definition of these. So these are independent of the choice of basis. Okay, that's the reason why we expand in the basis of these modified spherical harmonics instead of the original spherical harmonics. So ILM. Okay. Although you could, of course, certainly do it, right? Because any function of theta and phi with appropriate periodicity can be expanded in this basis. Okay. But the price you pay will be that the corresponding coefficients of expansion will not depend on the choice of basis. Right? And this way you just avoid it. Okay. And then we can look at the 2-point correlation functions of these objects. But we carry out one more step before we discuss these 2-point functions. So is this clear so far? Okay, what we are doing? Okay, we just expand this q plus minus I in this new basis that we have defined. Okay. And with this choice, okay, these are independent of the choice of basis. Okay, these coefficients of expansion. So now we define what is called the E and B mode polarizations. So ABLM, the normalization is arbitrary, okay, just some convenience. Sorry, this is not B, this is E. And ABLM is minus 1 over 2i. And the result that I'm going to quote but without proof is that AELM, after all, where is AELM coming from? This is the fluctuation in polarization, right? And as we discussed, this must come from the anisotropic in the incident photons before the last scattering. So it must somehow be related to the fluctuations that have been produced. So this, in general, is a linear combination of Ri and Hs. Okay. So this is the linear combination of both the scalar mode and the tensor mode. But ABLM is proportional to well, maybe I could take still 2 HSS is a linear combination of HS1, which means that if we calculate now ABLM, ABL prime A prime, okay, this now is the angular average. You calculate this over for various choices of the coordinate axis, just like we did for the scalar fluctuation. So this contains information about the tensor power spectrum. PT, which is call it delta T square over 2 pi square. Maybe I am not completely sure of this factor. Okay, anyway, let me write PT proportional to delta T square. So because of this relation, the fluctuation in the B mode polarization is one of the important quantities for which a lot of experimental effort is going on. Because observation of B mode fluctuation, fluctuation of this kind will be a direct evidence of the existence of tensor modes, and which, as we saw, comes from the quantum fluctuation of gravitational field during the time of the inflation. Is this point clear?
And sir, is this a direct observable? This.
Yes, it is a direct observable, because you see what is necessary to observe it, right? I mean, after all, this one is observable, right? Ij is observable, right? You just look in a given direction and measure the intensity of for different polarizations, right? So to measure this, you have to measure the polarization of the microwave photon, right? For every photon that we receive, you have to look at its polarization, okay, and calculate and take the weighted average of those various photons over those various photons, right? So IIJ is certainly observable, and once IIJ is observable, then everything else follows from there, right? Because everything else is defined in terms of I. So it is indeed observable, right? The difficulty is in measuring polarized photons, okay? Because the point is when you actually look at a microwave photon, right, there are various other effects of polarization, and you have to make sure that you remove all those effects, okay, to see what is really can be traceable to the primordial origin of the polarization. Right? For example, if on the way it scattered off some dust, okay, that can change this polarization, right? So because of this feature, so in other words, just like we saw that the last scattering could change the polarization, right? If it so happened that as the photon is traveling, right, it was not the last scattering that caused the polarization, but scattering from some other dust on the way, right, that caused the polarization. Then you'll be making a mistake, right? Then that's not what you are counting here. So it's a difficult measurement, but it's certainly observable, right? If you could remove the effect of dust, right? Imagine that you can find a direction in the sky where there is no dust, so that you directly observe the CMB coming to you. Then that will provide a cleaner measurement of this ABLF, the B mode.
Yeah.
So it is certainly observable, right? It's just a difficult observation. So let me just quote the bound and then I'll stop the lectures. Okay, so basically what current bound, okay, currently no observation is, there is no, I mean, it has not been observed. Okay, even though a few years ago people thought that they have observed it. Okay, at present we can only put a bound on this. And that is this R, which if you remember was defined as delta T square over delta S square. This is less than 0.2. Okay, that's all you know at present. But let me emphasize again, the observation of R will imply existence of tensor modes. And this in turn will imply quantum gravity fluctuation during inflation. Okay, are there questions? Okay, so if not, what I'm going to do now is that in the remaining part, okay, let me just suggest some topics, right? And then if you have any topic in mind, you can discuss it, right? And so next, I mean, I think this lecture should probably be over by next week. And so after that, you have to submit your homework and give the report on the project and give a talk. So let me first list a set of possible project topics. One is what we already discussed, okay, the B mode and the relationship between B mode and tensor perturbation, because I have not given any derivation. Okay, so this is certainly a good project, and then you can work around it, right? There are various effects that one can study, like weak cleansing and so on. But if you again look up Dodelson's book, I think you will find a lot of ideas of what to do here. The second one, which is more related to observation, but also very important, is what is called the Hubble tension. So this is a tension between two classes of measurements of the Hubble parameter. There is tension between two sets of measurements. Of H naught. Okay, that today's Hubble parameter. Okay. So one is that straightforward one, okay, which is that the first that measurement is that you observe well nearby objects. So nearby in quotes, right? I mean, it's not very nearby really, okay, but relatively nearby. And find distance redshift relation. Okay, remember that in the beginning of the lectures, we showed that if we know the relation between distance and redshift, we can calculate the H naught, right? Present rate of expansion. And nearby basically means the redshift of order 1 and so on, right? Not very far. The second measurement comes from the cosmological observation. Okay, so let me just say this is CMB. So what one does here is the following. Okay, that you remember that we had this plot, this L into L plus 1 times CL versus L, right? And you had this so basically, as you saw, okay, that this part is complicated, but it certainly can be studied within cosmology, okay, because you understand the physics of this, and you have to take into account more and more effects to make more and more accurate prediction. So what people do is that we assume some cosmological parameters, assume some values of cosmological parameters. So what are the cosmological parameters? Like omega m, omega lambda. Omega r is not really very important. Omega m, omega lambda, H naught, and various other things. Okay, baryon density, NB, or maybe say omega b. And then we try to find the best fit curve, right? So then predict the curve, this L into L plus 1 times CL versus L curve. And then adjust the parameters to find the best fit value. And all the parameters enter, because you not only have to find out how these are produced, but also you have to take into account the fact that after this is produced, it's traveling through the universe, right? And that depends on the geometry of space-time, right? What we see is not what is produced, right? Because it has to travel through the geometry of space-time. During that, there may be redshifts and various other effects. So all of these parameters enter in that calculation. Okay, and you can adjust each of these to find the best fit values of these parameters that fits this law. And it turns out that the H naught that comes out of these two analyses are different, right? So this gives you H naught roughly around 67 kilometer per second per megaparsec, whereas the nearby object measurement so this measurement is basically sensing the universe all the way to the to z of order 1000, right? Because that's why the redshift, that's what the last scattering was. So near object measurement gives you H naught. I think the mean value is 74 kilometer per second per megaparsec. So it's reasonably close, okay, but nevertheless the error bars, okay, in both are small enough so that this is regarded as tension between these two kinds of measurements. So that's one possible choice of project topic. I mean, you have to look at the both how this is measured from CMB and how it's measured from the distance redshift measurement. How do you measure distance, for example, and so on, and then summarize this the tension between these two measurements. Other questions? Okay, so then I'll mention another topic, which is effective field theory of inflation. Okay, this is a somewhat more formal topic. So essentially, the idea here is that normally we have been the way we studied inflation is that we assume some particular form of scalar potential, and then we can find these flow rule parameters, etc., and study its effect. And then we can add corrections to that and see if the corrections spoil inflation or not. Okay, and as we have been discussing, if the scalar field travels further than the Planck scale, okay, then there is a danger of it affecting the potential in a way that violates flow rule conditions. So this effective field theory of inflation is a somewhat model-independent way of analyzing all these effects. Okay. The effects of, say, higher dimension corrections. Okay, if adding corrections of the form which are higher powers in the scalar field, right, which could possibly spoil inflation. Okay. So the advantage of this approach is that you can discuss this in a somewhat model-independent way. Okay. So this requires some knowledge of field theory, but probably you have enough of the knowledge of quantum field theory to study this. Okay, so it requires some knowledge of QFT. Yeah, and if you want to study this and at least see what is in this, I think there is a paper which so this is the paper that you can look up. Yeah, I think it will be recorded anyway. So 0709.029 from 0293. Okay. So you can look at this, and then I mean, it's much further work after this. Okay, but this is basically the paper that is the starting point of this discussion, effective field theory of inflation. So that's one possible topic. Then you can look at axionic dark matter. Okay. I discussed some part of it, okay, but not in full detail. For example, about the production mechanism, right? We didn't discuss much. Okay, unlike the weakly interacting massive particles, where mechanism, where we discuss how things how actually the particles are produced and how to calculate the relic density. Right? A similar analysis can be done for axionic dark matter. So that could be a possible topic. Okay, so these are more or less the suggestions that I have. But if you have some things that you want to do the project on, you can discuss it now. Okay,
I had two in mind. One is constraints on neutrino, sum of neutrino masses from like cosmology, and there was another on reheating.
Okay, so constraint on neutrino masses from cosmology, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you want to do a project on that, that's perfectly fine. Okay. Any other suggestions?
Yeah, another was reheating.
Reheating, okay. Yeah, reheating certainly we didn't discuss very much, okay, except at a very qualitative level. Yes, okay. Any other suggestion?
I was thinking about galaxy formation and like
Okay,
after last scattering.
yeah, okay. So that part certainly I have not discussed at all. But this will require some numerical studies, right? But anyway, you can report on how exactly that things are done, right? Not, you may not need to actually run the numerical program, or you can run some small programs, but you can discuss how it is done, right? What is involved in doing this study.
Sir, I'm thinking about neutrino oscillation in curved space-time.
Neutrino oscillation in curved space-time. Okay, that's fine. Okay, neutrino oscillation in curved space-time.
Sir, I was thinking about the cosmological perturbations leading to the structure formation.
Okay, yeah, so that's probably similar to this, right? But if both of you want to work on this, that's also fine. The galaxy structure formation, yeah. Because I'm sure there'll be different viewpoints. Okay, people. Okay, any other suggestion?
Sir, I was thinking of cosmological constant problem.
Cosmological constant problem. Okay. That, of course, nobody really knows very much. But yeah, you can certainly give a report on what is known and how people try to address this. Okay, so you can think about all this, and if you want to come up with other topics, okay, or different topics, then that's also fine. You can write to me, or you can discuss it in the classes next week.
So I was also thinking, like, not maybe as a project topic, but like other models of cosmology apart from the Big Bang one.
Okay.
Although I didn't find any modern discussions.
Okay, you can try it. At least you can compare, right, Big Bang with other models of cosmology and see what are the advantages. Here I could say that there is a alternative to inflation. Okay, it's not an alternative to Big Bang, but which is called ekpyrotic universe. Okay, if you look at the ekpyrotic universe, okay. So this is not quite other models of cosmology in the sense that they are the part which involves Big Bang is the same, okay, except that it replaces inflation by something else. Okay, that could fall in the same category of other models of cosmology. But you can certainly look at also other models like steady state model and so on.
Yeah. Also, like, do you have a like modern source for them? Because all I found was like 60s and 70s. Because after CMB data, people sort of rejected these models.
Yeah, I don't think there is that much modern work going on in this field. Right? Because it's very hard to explain CMB. Okay, I mean, okay, people have attempted to explain CMB by radiation from dust and so on, but those are all very contrived scenarios. Right? There is a very natural explanation of CMB from in Big Bang, right, which is hard to accommodate in any of these other cosmologies.
Also, is quintessence like along the lines of inflation only?
No, quintessence is along the line of cosmological constant problem, right? So here the idea is that the cosmological constant that we see is not quite a constant; it's actually zero. Okay, that if you think of, so it's similar to inflation, but it's happening today. Okay, so if you take V, I'll use a different name because it need not be the same as inflation. Okay, so imagine that there is a scalar field whose potential has a very slow slope, and then eventually it reaches a minimum, right? And the idea of quintessence is that we are rolling, the scalar field is rolling like this. It's rolling very slowly, okay, because the potential is nearly flat. And the cosmological constant that is C today is basically coming from this V of chi, okay, because it's non-zero today, right? So it effectively acts like an inflation, but eventually it will stop. But this, of course, happens at a much lower scale, right? Clearly, today's cosmological constant is much smaller than the cosmological constant during inflation. But otherwise, the physics is like that of an inflation. Slowly rolling scalar field. So this is what is called quintessence. So this could fall in the category of cosmological constant. That's one attempt to explain what cosmological constant could be today. But the problem, of course, is that this cosmological constant problem as such, right, is not explaining why it's not zero. Because zero is not a natural value anyway, right? So the cosmological constant problem, I mean, it's only our prejudice that we get worried that why it's not zero. But why zero is not a natural value. Because it's, I mean, there's plenty of scalar fields in the, at least one, right, Higgs. And the minimum of the Higgs potential, right, has no spatial role. It gets corrected. There are, as you saw, there are harmonic oscillators, so there are ground state energies, vacuum energy. And what we see as a cosmological constant is a result of cancellation of all those, right? As a result of sum over all the ground state energies from bosons, fermions. Bosons contribute to one sign, fermions contribute to another sign, and so on. And so there is no reason to expect that it should be zero. The puzzle is why it's so small, right? Why it's not of the order of the Planck scale. Because if we just naturally estimate it, right, because the ultraviolet cutoff we expect to be the Planck scale, we expect that the actual value of the potential at the minimum should be of the order of Planck scale. So the cosmological constant problem should really be thought of as explaining, as the problem of explaining why it is so small and not why it is non-zero. Because if it was zero, right, it didn't really have an explanation, right? People did a lot of work to try to figure out why is it zero, right? When people thought that it's zero, they thought that maybe there is some symmetry because of which it's zero, but nobody ever found any symmetry that can make cosmological constant zero. So the correct way to view cosmological constant problem is not why it's not zero, but why it's not very large. Right? So from that point of view, quintessence really doesn't help very much, right? Because imagine that the potential is like something like this, right? That eventually it will reach zero. It provides no explanation of why the minimum is at zero. So you're back to the original problem of explaining why a cosmological constant is zero. I mean, I think it's more psychological that people think that maybe zero, I mean, even though don't have an explanation, zero is something that may be easier to explain than something which is very small, like 10 to the minus 120. But that's a prejudice, right? Because we don't know how to explain zero.
Like from field theory, there is absolutely no reason for this like shift, right? In the sense that we can perform an arbitrary shift at the like
If you
shift the overall potential by anything.
If you exclude gravity, but once you have
Right.
gravity, then of course it's not invariant under a shift symmetry, right? Because gravity couples to the energy, that vacuum energy.
Yeah. So like is quintessence like involves gravity in the field theory sense?
No, it doesn't. But eventually, see the point is, if there is no gravity, then this constant value of the potential will have no effect at all, right? It will be unobservable.
Yeah, but it affects the background gravity in the sense that as a cosmological constant.
Exactly.
Yeah, so there we can add numbers in the sense that we can add an overall 10 to the minus whatever 120.
We can, except that, I mean, if there is really a fundamental theory, right, from where everything is calculable. In string theory, for example, you cannot add anything. In string theory, there is no freedom of adding a constant to the potential, right? You have to basically take what you get. So in any fundamental theory, right, where everything is well defined from the beginning, the cosmological constant should be something that you can calculate, not something that you put in by hand. But if you think of this as just a quantum field theory coupled to gravity, then you have really no control and it's something that you put in by hand.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, any other suggestions or comments, questions? Okay, so if not, I'll stop here. And next week, as I said, most likely there will be 2 lectures. Okay, I don't think it will spill over to the 3rd.
Sir,
Yes.
sir, when are we planning to have the talks?
Talks, okay, it depends on when I'm supposed to give the grades. I mean, maybe the end of May, is it okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, so roughly let's fix it at the end of May, because I think that since the semester started in February, it is supposed to go until the end of May.
Yeah, okay.
So tentatively near the end of May. Okay, so then I'll stop today and we'll meet next week.
So
Yes, go ahead, please.
do you suppose after like the course is over and you have time, you could teach us something else?
Something else. Okay, we'll see. I mean, we have to decide on something else. Yeah.
I mean, personally, I would prefer anything like conformal field theory or something.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. I mean, that if it starts, it will be maybe in June.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.